All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I am very, very excited about this interview that's coming up right now. You're going to be excited about it too. We're all going to learn a lot, especially from a liberty perspective, about protecting liberty and guarding against government overreach. But before I bring on my guest, I'm going to remind you to like this and to share this and to also subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button. That way you'll be notified whenever I upload a new episode or a new interview. Also, check out my Substack at libertychasers.com. It's called Chasing Liberty, where I talk about everything liberty and all that great stuff. But without further ado, because I'm too excited to keep going on, let me bring on my guest. I have with me from the 10th Amendment Center, Mr. Michael Boldin. What's going on, brother?
Awesome. No pressure at all. This just has to be my most awesome interview in history.
Yes. Yeah, it has to surpass.
We'll see. We'll see what I can do. We'll see what I can do.
Yes, bigly, definitely.
Right.
So,
well, I appreciate you. I appreciate you having me join the show. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. This is gonna be great. But before we get into nullification, why don't you give us some background on yourself, or maybe like the one person who might not know who you are? Who is Michael Boldin?
I'm just some dude who was absolutely disgusted by the war machine during the George W. Bush administration and decided to register a domain name, 10thamendmentcenter.com, back in 2006. I'm an old school anti-war activist. And it wasn't just war, though. I started seeing how no matter who is in power, doesn't matter who is there, which team is there, power keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. I learned a lot from the late, great Harry Browne. For those of you in the libertarian realm, he was actually one of my inspirations to get things going here. I only had one brief email exchange with him before he passed away, but I guess that's the background there. Former socialist. Now I don't know how you labeled me, but people in power don't like it.
Yeah, they never do. They want you in at least one of the authoritarian buckets.
Yeah, they always ask you, where do you land? And I think it's because they like to pigeonhole you. And every time I've had a mainstream media interview, and I've been interviewed by Reuters and New York Times and CBS and all kinds of people over the years, and they always want to put you into a bucket, just like you said, because then they can kind of attack you by association with other groups. Mm-hmm. And I'm always just like, man, I'm nothing. All I am is me, and all I want is to live free.
Yeah, that's like the story of my life. I mean, if I'm on X one day, I'm a Democrat because I'm criticizing Republicans. The next day, I'm a Republican because I'm criticizing Democrats. And the best thing about being in our position is that whataboutism doesn't work on us. So if I criticize a Democrat,
yeah, for real,
comes at me saying, well, look at what this Republican did, I'll be like, yeah, I agree. That sucked too. I don't like him either.
Yeah, because the bottom line is they all suck.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. All right. So speaking of things that suck and how to nullify them, let's talk about nullification. Now, there's two ways that people talk about nullification, and I want to discuss both because the arguments for and against and the issues that pertain to it apply to both. So we have jury nullification. And then we have the type of nullification where a local or state government may nullify an unconstitutional or an unjust law passed by a higher form of government, like the federal level. Or maybe if you're talking at the local level, it might be your state government. So let's just start with the basics. What exactly is nullification, and how is it different when practiced by states or local governments or juries?
Okay, I think that's a big question, to be honest with you, because nullification, when you really distill it down to its basics, it's the enforcement mechanism for the Constitution. And that could be for the Constitution of these United States. It could be a constitution of a state. Basically, when government doesn't follow the rules given to it, which is, honestly, it's 24/7, 365, what do you do about it? Do you go to the government and you ask the government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place? Or is government supposed to be something else, grounded in principles of the American Revolution? Government is only supposed to be an agent of the people of the several states. And so when government doesn't follow the rules that the people of the several states gave to it, then it's ultimately up to the people themselves to keep the government in check. John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, he was the lead author of the Articles of Confederation. He also wrote a series of essays in support of ratification of the Constitution. He discussed this. He didn't call it nullification, but he said, a good Constitution promotes but doesn't always produce a good administration. Well, we always have bad administration. So he asked the question, when there is a bad administration, what is to be done? And the answer, he said, is instantly found before the supreme sovereignty of the people. So the final authority of the people themselves. He said it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved, or in the Roman phrase, on perilous occasions, to provide that the republic receive no damage. And I can assure you that if you're just trying to choose new people to run the largest government in the history of the planet, that is not following the duty to provide that the republic receive no damage. And so that's really the first part of your question. Should we get right to the second, or are we going to branch out, do a side quest?
No, go ahead. Go on ahead.
Okay, so you're asking about different forms of nullification, whether it's state or local or jury, and I would say they're all the same. Yeah. I mean, they're different mechanisms of the same tool. So, I mean, we can dive in a lot deeper as we go through this, but the short version is, let's say a state passes some kind of nullification law that says, okay, the ATF is illegal in our state, right? Well, the federal government is going to follow that. They're going to say, well, you're a state. We don't care. Federal supremacy. We're going to do what we want to do. So they're going to come in and try to enforce with the ATF, which shouldn't exist, like the DEA and all these other agencies. They're going to continue doing what governments do. Government continues doing what it will always do until the people do something to stop it. And so even though there's something on the books on a state level that says, well, the ATF is unconstitutional, we're nullifying it, as long as the people continue to comply with it, comply with the ATF, they follow those rules and regulations, nothing's been nullified. It's just words on paper. So then government comes in and arrests people for following the state end instead of the federal end. Well, that's when jury nullification comes in. It's kind of that last line of defense, the peaceful solution where you say, yeah, you may have violated that National Firearms Act of 1934, but we're still going to vote to acquit. So even if they arrest people, we're going to set them free.
So this is and there was a reason why I didn't just single out one form of nullification, because it's all connected. And what you just said really highlighted that. And really, I mean, when I hear the word nullification, I just think disobedience. Like, you're just not going to obey constitutional laws. Like, if they want to get your guns, or if they want to get more restrictions on those guns, then you don't comply, really. And that's how I see nullification.
And you can go all the way back to the early parts of the American Revolution for this foundation. This is exactly what they did in response to the hated Stamp Act in 1765. Patrick Henry drafted a series of resolutions called the Virginia Resolves of 1765, where, he kind of had a precursor to the whole system of the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. That is, the British had certain powers, but other powers like internal taxation could only be wielded by the local representatives of the people, the representatives of the legislature or the assembly of the colony. And soon as the far-off government goes beyond its limits, those acts are void. Now, void in theory is one thing. Void on paper is one thing. But void in practice requires action. And Patrick Henry said the people are not bound to yield obedience to anything like the Stamp Act. And this was how they actually nullified the Stamp Act in practice and effect. John Dickinson, again, the penman of the Revolution that I cited just before, he wrote a very popular broadside, a pamphlet talking about how to defeat the Stamp Act. He said, this is really a test of your kind of mental state. He said, if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains around your unhappy country. So you have to refuse to comply. Otherwise, again, government will continue doing what government does. Lysander Spooner may have summed it up best. He said, Talk is cheap. This is my paraphrase. Talk is cheap to tyrants. Tyrants care nothing for discussion, is how he said it, unless that action is followed up with something that will interfere with the enforcement of their laws. Noncompliance is really, really the foundation of nullification. It's the foundation of liberty.
And it's interesting that you characterized it as a test. The Stamp Act and some of the other policies, because once you said that, my mind immediately went to COVID-19. That was a test
Oh, yeah.
to see what we would be
Oh,
willing
yeah.
to tolerate. I think by and large we failed that test, but I think a lot of individuals and a lot of small pockets did not fail that test. I mean, there were churches that refused to remain shut down during COVID-19 despite all these lockdown orders. That's just one small example of nullification right there. I just think people don't really think of it in those terms.
Yeah, they generally associate it with kind of the cartoon version that we get in the government-run schools, and that is nullification is for racists who want to protect slavery, and they're going to pass a law on a state level, and then suddenly the federal government has to follow that law because if a state says something is illegal, then it automatically gets overturned as if it's the Supreme Court voiding something. And that's just absurd. No one actually thought that, other than maybe John C. Calhoun, but that's probably a different conversation here. But none in the founding generation looked at it. They understood that repeatedly, and we heard this over and over and over. We saw it all throughout the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson, who a lot of people credit with creating nullification, he certainly did not, but he cited principles even in 1774 saying that they were declaring British acts null and void because they were beyond the limits of what they considered the Constitution, the unwritten British Constitution. This has a long history in the American tradition. It's a long process to get things done when you're going against the largest government in history. But as Samuel Adams told us, when you have enough fortitude and perseverance, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. In other words, we the people have to learn how to exercise our rights, whether we get a permission slip from government or not.
Yeah, and that concept is, I think, is so foreign to people by and large today. Like,
Yes.
like even so, here's my question, because I mean, even the idea, even if you don't use the word nullification, but you even
Right.
propose the idea that maybe we shouldn't be obeying some of these laws, or maybe most of them, it tends to really trigger people. It almost really gets them feeling uncomfortable. How did this become so controversial when back in the day, I mean, it seemed like most people understood the concept.
Well, back in the day, they definitely did. And we can talk about how they responded to the whiskey tax against George Washington. As soon as they passed this thing, there's all kinds of people, not just in Pennsylvania, but in Virginia and Kentucky and elsewhere, that are saying, what? This is an internal tax. Didn't we have a revolution? Didn't we fight a war of secession against the empire in order to get away from these types of things? And then now you're going to do it to us just a few years later? They immediately refused to comply. And even though, again, the government school history lesson tells us that George Washington called up the army and marched in and crushed the defiance, this is absolutely absurd, because when you go throughout the records in places like Kentucky, they didn't enforce it at all. And ultimately, it was the resistance by the people that brought it to an end. And it was repealed because of that resistance, because they couldn't enforce it. We also saw resistance to Thomas Jefferson's embargo. When he came in to be president, he issued some embargo to block trade because he wanted to manipulate policy with the British. Whether that was a good or a bad thing, they couldn't get it enforced at all in places like New Orleans, New England, etc. The founding generation and the early part of the Republic, resistance was key to keeping government in check. Whether it succeeded or not every time is a different question, because it does take constant follow-up. It's the nature of government to always grow at the expense of our liberty. So as soon as people start letting up, whether they're afraid or they're comfortable or whatever the reason is, then it starts really getting out of control. And we didn't end up where we are today. Again, largest government in history,
Yeah.
out of nowhere.
Yeah, yeah. So this concept that we're talking about here, what would you say is the constitutional basis of it? After the Articles of Confederation, they made the Constitution, but that idea still persisted. So what would you say is the constitutional basis of this type of disobedience or nullification?
Well, the constitutional basis is that under the Constitution, all power flows from the people of the several states. Government is merely the agent of the people. And it was repeatedly told to the people during the ratification conventions when they were considering whether or not to adopt this in the states. Well, what are you going to do if government doesn't follow these rules we've put on paper? And one of the ones that I cited, John Dickinson, he already explained this. Like, look, we can have the best constitution possible, but the best constitution is going to do is just promote a good administration. And when it doesn't, well, then the people have to do stuff. We can also cite people like Roger Sherman, who said very similar. James Iredell, one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court in the North Carolina ratifying convention, he was asked the same kind of thing. Well, what are we going to do if they violate these rules we've given to it? He said, the people will resist if government usurps power not delegated to them. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, writing in Federalist number 46, he gave us a strategy of how to defeat federal programs. And he said specifically, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. This is a common thread, even from the Federalist side, who repeatedly told us, if you want to enforce this document, this is how it's going to go.
That's just, I'm like thinking, like, what if I were James Madison looking at us now? Because,
oh, dude,
I mean, he's got to be rolling over in his grave because they pass laws and we just go along with it. We might protest a little bit. We may complain about it on social media, and that's about it. I mean, how do we get here? How did that happen?
well, I think people get very comfortable. Mercy Otis Warren, the great historian of the American Revolution, and I can't really rattle the quote off my head, but she had a passage in this kind of multi-volume set about the American Revolution about how all through history, people tend to get kind of comfortable. They get comfortable with established modes of obedience. And it really takes something kind of just so insanely bad that finally shakes them out of their slumber before they stand up and resist the first approaches of tyranny. Resisting tyranny is how it has to play out. Otherwise, well, you end up in a really, really bad place. And I think here in the United States of America, we, the people, have had it pretty comfortable for a long, long time. And it seems like, oh, all of a sudden things got bad. I know you mentioned COVID, which in some ways, the lockdowns actually gave us a little bit of a silver lining. Not everyone is just purely complying, but it is showing us that after all these years and all these precedents, during that time, they were even citing precedents in court cases from the early 1900s to justify their power. So this stuff has been on the books forever, but sooner or later they push too far, and then people will say enough is enough. I don't think we're anywhere close to that, to be honest with you, but I'm seeing kind of some glimmers of hope. Of course, we've seen so many dozens of states now resisting federal prohibition on a cannabis plant.
Yeah.
We're starting to see a handful of states do the same kind of approach regarding the right to keep and bear arms. Missouri, Arizona, and a few other states are saying, well, we're not going to participate in the enforcement of various federal gun control programs. Montana has a limited version of that as well. And the more that we see this happen, the less opposition we get from people who say, well, what about on this other issue? Far less than it was maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some promising signs. I mean, and the answer you gave is kind of what I've been thinking. I mean, people are just too comfortable. Like it's just not affecting them as much. And until that changes, it's going to be hard to really bring about actual change. But that being said, you're right. There are areas in which people are resisting, whether it's at the local or state level. You mentioned cannabis. You mentioned the Second Amendment. There are Second Amendment sanctuaries scattered across the country. I mean, when Illinois tried to pass that assault weapons ban, like half their sheriffs said, okay, but we're not going to enforce that though. So to me,
Right.
those are very encouraging signs. They're not enough, but
Nope.
but it does show that this concept has not become extinct.
It is not. In some ways, it's actually far more common to see this type of response today. If we're just using like raw numbers, for example, the number of people who are defying the federal prohibition on cannabis. Okay, well, I got my medical card from my state, or my state said I have permission. But ultimately, for 50 years, even before California, well, maybe not 50 full years, but from the early 70s, people in California were defying not just the federal prohibition on cannabis,
Mhm.
but state level prohibitions on cannabis as well. I mean, there were all kinds of businesses being open in the Bay Area, despite the fact that the state was saying it as well. So the same type of approach. It's actually a little bit more difficult versus the states, and if we have time, we can get into that.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, but it's happening all over the place. And I think the raw numbers are far greater than what happened in response to the whiskey tax or to Jefferson's embargo or even to Mr. Madison's War of 1812, when state governors were saying, we're not going to release our militia troops to federal service because they're not authorized by the Constitution in any situation to be involved in invasion of a foreign country, i.e. Canada at that time. So we see far more happening today, but in comparison to the amount of far more government we have today, it's still just scratching the surface.
Yeah, yeah, and you were mentioning that it might be harder to do it when you're pushing back against the state level. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Most enforcement really does happen on a state and a local level. So even if you're talking about federal gun control, the ATF, they have about, and it varies year in and year out, somewhere around 5 or 6,000 employees total. About a third of them are pencil pushers. They're in administration. And I went to government run schools, so my math is terrible. What does that leave us? Maybe like 3,500 or so who
Yeah.
are enforcement agents. Year in and year out, they have a maximum capacity of closing somewhere between 8 and 11,000 cases. Now, that to me is 8 to 11,000 too many. But that's 8 and 11,000 with support of state and local law enforcement. Most ATF enforcement actions aren't just a bunch of ATF agents rolling into a neighborhood and then just raiding a home or a business or something like that. Almost every single time. And if you read through their press releases on all their successes in enforcement, they're working in conjunction with the local law enforcement. Maybe there's one or two ATF guys standing in the back as they go bust down a door, but the people
They're
busting
there to
down the
shoot the dog.
door, the people doing the logistics, it's, yeah, the ones who are shooting the dog too are probably the local cops. And so as long as the locals continue to do the enforcement, that's where you're getting the most impact. Even the FBI, when it talks about cannabis enforcement, I believe the most recent number I saw was a few years ago. It's like 98% of all enforcement actions involve or are led or done completely by local law enforcement. And that to me is really the big reason why it's a little bit more difficult on the local level, because that's where they're kind of putting all the guns.
Are you familiar with Dexter Taylor's case?
Not super familiar. I mean, I know the name, of course.
Okay, so because what you said reminded me of his case, so I'll just give a very quick thumbnail sketch. So Dexter Taylor, Brooklyn
Okay.
native, no criminal record. He was sent to prison, convicted last year for manufacturing his own firearms. And again, no criminal record. He didn't even fire the firearms. And in his case, in his trial, the judge straight up said that he and his attorney could not bring up the Second Amendment in his
Oh,
defense.
that's that one. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what's interesting though is the reason why they got onto him is because of the ATF. They pressure these companies to share certain types of data. And so he was buying these parts legally online using his credit card. He didn't think anything was wrong. And the ATF saw that these were being sent to
Mm-hmm.
New York, which has a ban on assault weapons, has all these horrible gun laws. And then so the ATF connected with the NYPD, and they both raided his home. But that was spearheaded by the NYPD at the behest of the ATF. So so that's what happens. But what's interesting in his case is, when I interviewed his attorney, he told me, his name is Vinu Varghese, and he told me that not only the Second Amendment thing happened, but the judge also, she didn't say this outright, but she kind of led the jurors to believe that if they did not vote to convict him, that there could possibly be some type of consequences. Because really, nullification
Yeah.
was the only way that he could have gotten out of this, because he did manufacture the firearms, but those laws are a violation of the Second Amendment. So, is it even possible to punish a juror who or a jury that refuses to convict somebody, even if they believe they are guilty, which would be jury nullification.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't put it past any of these governments to try to pull off whatever they feel they want to do to keep people afraid from standing up to them. So, New York is notorious for many, many years, maybe multiple decades of trying to shut down jury nullification. One of the most important, I can't remember his name, but he passed away, old guy who had been doing fully informed jury nullification pamphleting outside of courthouses for years. They harassed him his entire life. Basically, he would just hand out information to just say, if you believe that this law is unjust, you can vote to acquit. And they would try to treat that as jury tampering. So the government always tries to stack things in favor of the government, not just in kind of pressuring the jury into believing that the only thing that they can do is vote yes or no on the facts of the case rather than the law itself. But also, well, by trying to shut down any information, by trying to choose people who are more willing to make the case in support of the government and the like. So it's very, very difficult. And that's why education on this is so important. But yeah, in that situation, ultimately, it tells us a couple of things. One, relying on the government to protect you from the government is stupid and dangerous. But when you're stuck in that situation, you still got to do your best. And you really do need a community effort to make it work. And in most places, we don't have that.
Yeah, so and I think that's one of the issues, right? I mean, I think if you were to ask the average American if they understood the concept of nullification, whether it's jury nullification or other types, I mean, you could ask 100 people and maybe one might know if you're lucky. And
Mhm.
it just doesn't seem like it's like we were talking about before. We've gone from a society that fully understood the concept and put it into practice to one that is way more
Right.
compliant. How do we reverse that?
Well, I think the government is helping us by getting so aggressive in so many scenarios on so many issues. And that sounds horrible because they harm people every single day. Every time they come in and, whether it's an innocuous regulation that, forces small businesses to shut down, or it's a COVID lockdown, or it's a new regulation, common sense gun control, or keeping kids away from dangerous stuff on the internet, they're harming people every single day. But the more they do that, the more people's eyes are opened up. And I think we do have a very, very long process ahead of us. To be honest with you, I'm a total cynic. I
Mm,
mean, I spend all day, every day. I'm almost on 20 years of doing this. 10th Amendment Center was launched in 2006, in June of
yeah.
2006. And most people who do this kind of work, they're literally like, well, and there's not too many people who do this specific kind of work, but anything involved in trying to advance liberty, generally they focus on things that they think they can accomplish. To be honest with you, I don't think we're going to have a land of the free in my lifetime. I don't think it's even remotely possible. But I do feel some kind of a moral duty to try to set the foundation and get the word out to as many people as possible so some future generation can get the job done.
You know, I hate to say it, but I agree. I mean, for the past few years since I've been doing what I'm doing, a lot of people ask me,
It's rough, man.
it is rough. It is rough because they'll say, do you think it's ever going to get better? And I say, yeah, I think so, but it's going to get worse first because the
Yeah,
nullification concept isn't really going to take root again until enough people feel the pain. It doesn't have to be everybody who feels the pain. It may not even need to be
right.
most Americans that feel the pain. You just need enough. You just need enough for people to be
Yep.
able to say, wait a minute, what is going on here? Wait a minute. Oh, what's this nullification concept? Wait, you mean I could disobey? You mean what if enough of us disobey? What if 50% of the country just stop paying taxes? They can't arrest everybody, right? That so
And they can't arrest all the cannabis users. We've got
they
millions of
can't.
them out there. And when we first started doing this years ago, it was insane. If I was going to a place, it wasn't Oklahoma, but I remember going to some red states and talking about how, well, even if you guys on the right, you don't like this whole cannabis thing, look at what California's doing. When they were even just voting in the run up to the vote on Prop 215 in 1996, you know what happened? Three different presidents, one current one at the time and two previous one, came to California to say, you can't do this supremacy clause. If you try doing it, we are going to shut you down. They did it anyway. The Clinton administration, within months, in January or February of 1997, after they passed it, they started floating the idea of taking licenses from physicians in California who didn't even prescribe, but just merely recommended cannabis. They were literally trying a multi-pronged war to shut this thing down. And you know what? Enough people said no to Washington, D.C., and then eventually enough states are saying no to them that sooner or later the feds are going to have to back down and pretend that they're legalizing what the people are already doing just to save face.
Yeah, and I think that and it reminds me of when the war on drugs first started, not under Nixon, but under Woodrow Wilson, with Harry Anslinger and all that. I mean, they were already going after doctors.
I don't know that history. I
Oh,
don't know that history at all.
yeah,
I mean, I know the marijuana stamp tax from FDR, but I don't know all the way back to Woodrow. That does not surprise me. That dude was a tyrant.
Oh, yeah, I knew it was surprising. Yeah, I mean, it was the Harrison something act. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'll send you the information. I've done some writing on it.
Oh, I'd love to see that. Yeah.
They just weren't
Thank
calling
you.
it. Yeah, they just weren't calling it the war on drugs back then. Nixon did that, but it started way
Yes.
before him, and they were cracking on doctors for prescribing narcotics. Like today it would be heroin or maybe opium, things like that. And they really wanted to crack down, so they went after the doctors because at a certain point they allowed people to have it as long as they had a prescription. But then they started going after them for
Hmm.
those prescriptions, and then it kind of snowballed and expanded and expanded. So, but it's still, even though they target people, like it still got to where, at least with marijuana, there is disobedience happening. So what would you say? What would you say are the biggest misconceptions people have about this concept of nullification?
Well, they don't know anything about it. They don't realize. I think the number one conception is they don't realize that this is how you enforce the Constitution. You have to have non-compliance with unconstitutional acts. Otherwise, government will never, ever, ever, in any situation, give up their own power. Maybe they'll throw you a little bone every few decades on one thing or another, but
Well,
that's just a scam, really, because their power continually grows. It doesn't matter who's in charge. So I think the greatest misconception is that people think that vote the bums out in the hopes that you just don't get new bums that continue expanding their power is how you defeat the federal government, or going to a federal court in the hopes that the federal judges are going to tell federal politicians to stop doing what they shouldn't have been doing in the first place. That's the greatest misconception, is that the tools that people have been using, they think are the way to stop federal power or government power in any level. And it really is not. That's not saying that people, I've never voted. I tried once for Ron Paul. I got a letter a few months later from the Secretary of State here in California that said, "Oh, we didn't see that you were on our rolls, so we didn't count your vote." I know there's some conspiracy theorists out there who think you really got way more than you did. I'm one of them, so
yeah.
that's legit, at least on that part of it. But that's the only time I ever tried voting, because I can't bring myself to this whole lesser of two evils thing. I just can't do it. I don't feel morally right about it, but I understand how other people will choose to vote defensively. The thing is, if that's all you're doing, you might as well give up. It's pointless.
Yeah, I mean, at best, you're just delaying the inevitable. But what do you think about maybe like say at the local level? Like we were talking about this just when we were talking about local police agencies going along with the ATF or the DEA. Do you think that there might be more of a role concentrated there at the local level, or do you think this is more about the public just refusing to comply, or maybe a mix of both? How do you see that fitting in?
Well, it really is a mix of both, because when you combine various strategies, you're far more effective. So a combination, first of all, again, the foundation of nullification, the foundation of constitutional enforcement, the foundation of liberty, in my mind, on all three of these are people exercising their rights, whether government wants them to or not, period. Jefferson put it like this. He said, "A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate." That's what it means to be a free people. Government is supposed to, protect liberty and whatever else it's supposed to be doing. I don't know. But if people don't start with that as a foundation, it doesn't matter how many local ordinances, state laws, are on the books, they do nothing. You really have to start with that as a foundation, but it certainly is much less difficult to, let's say, nullify federal gun control if your local law enforcement agencies aren't participating in the enforcement, because the ATF only has those like 3,500 or 4,000 agents to enforce for the entire country. Donald Trump, by the way, holds the record for the most federal gun control enforcement in American history, the most
Really?
enforcement actions in history. So that, oh yeah, he's the worst on the Second Amendment in history.
I didn't know that.
Like Joe Biden, oh yeah, he's terrible. He bragged about it in 2019. Last year, we prosecuted a record number of firearms offenses. I mean, the only number that he should be talking about is zero. There are no federal firearm offenses that are authorized by the Constitution. I mean, literally none. So he holds the record. He may also hold the number 2 spot. I don't remember. I know Joe Biden tried to beat him in his last year in office, but the Biden administration did not pass the Trump administration. The most ever was him. So relying on these people who promised to be a Second Amendment president is a failure. Relying on Obama to be a peace president is a failure. That's why the people have to kind of take a stand for themselves.
And it's funny because that reminds me, Trump is doing this crackdown in DC right now. And I understand, I mean, DC has a horrible crime rate. It's always had a high crime rate, like for ages. So I understand the need to get something done there. But I saw on X, they had released like a small list of some of the people that they've arrested so far. And I'm seeing a possession of a firearm, possession of a firearm without a
Oh
license.
man.
I'm like, that's not keeping anybody safe. That's violating their Second Amendment rights. I don't know if those people are dangerous or not. If they're dangerous, arrest them for committing a violent crime. I think there was only one person on there who had committed or who was suspected of having committed a violent crime. The rest were just people with drugs or with firearms. And I'm like, wait a minute. Did they do anything with those firearms that they weren't supposed to be doing? No. Then why should I be proud of this? Why should I be standing in applause for this?
Yeah, it's all a big show and government by press release. We arrested all these dangerous people. And then so he appeals to the socialist left who loves gun control, maybe to get enough people to win an election or something like that. And then he goes after drug owners, drug users, because that appeals to the hardcore conservative right who doesn't want them to do that. And to me, it's all absurd, because if you do want to make things safer, there are ways to make things safer that have nothing to do with arresting people for what they own or what they consume. It's about getting the government the hell out of the way in almost every situation, which creates the environment for so much criminality that we face. Now, I lived most of the last 20 years in the middle of downtown Los Angeles. We got out near the end of COVID because it was just so bad. Literally a block and a half from LAPD headquarters in downtown LA. If you saw the most recent protests, the ICE protests where there were some Waymo cars on fire, that was like my normal daily walk. That was like 3 blocks from my own old apartment. And, we saw a lot of criminal activity around there.
Oh, yeah.
But there was no situation where I ever would want armed troops marching in to somehow protect me. What I think would be better to protect people is, well, a little bit of gun safety training, and the right to keep and bear arms is really how you keep a safer society.
Yeah, I believe so. And if there is going to be a government there to protect your rights, maybe they should only be focusing on violent and property crimes and things like that. If they stop focusing on all this other stuff where people aren't really hurting other people, then they could actually lower the crime rate in DC and in LA. And I mean, I'm originally from Southern California. I used to work in Glendale, and I had to
Oh,
go
I didn't know that.
downtown LA. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, born and raised. And
How long ago did you live in Glendale?
well, I actually lived in Ranch Cucamonga, but I would commute to
Okay.
Glendale. Yeah.
Whoa, dude. That's a long drive.
Oh my, yeah. I'll tell you something. 2 hours
That must have been a
away.
nightmare.
Yeah, and I use public transportation too, so I saw the subways and all that
Yeah.
stuff. I
Oh
left.
yeah, I got robbed on a bus. I've been stabbed in Hollywood. I've been mugged. I mean, I've been through all this stuff. But I'll tell you, back when I was a social Trotskyite, really, I would identify with back in the day. Man, back then, when I really wouldn't even consider my exercising my right to keep and bear arms, had I had that mentality back then and done it without government permission, I probably wouldn't have been hurt at least a
Yeah,
few of those times.
yeah. Yeah, and it's crazy. I mean, one thing I will say about Trump is that I really hope that the Justice Department follows through on this Second Amendment task force that they did. If they do, then good. I mean, maybe that can help with Dexter Taylor's case and other stuff. But it's just, it doesn't matter what the letter is next to the name of the person who's in the Oval Office. Your rights are going to get violated. It just depends on which right you're talking about. Um, so here's what I wanted to do. I wanted to, since you're the expert, I looked up some of the most common arguments against the concept of nullification. And so I'm going to throw them at you.
Okay. Okay.
And,
I'm
and you,
ready. I'm
you,
ready.
you can knock them out. All right. So
We'll see what I got.
all right. So the first one is basically that nullification undermines the rule of law and creates chaos. If juries and counties or states can pick and choose which laws to follow or enforce or, vote to acquit or convict, then we'll have a fractured legal system where the law means different things in different places. So what would you say to that objection? Would that not make the Constitution meaningless in a sense?
Well, the Constitution is meaningless if you rely on the government to follow it. If that's not obvious to people, living under the largest government in history, $37 trillion in debt, foreign conquests decade in and decade out, violations of our right to keep and bear arms since 1934. For almost 100 years on a federal level, we've had 24/7, 365 constant violations on our natural right of self-defense, the drug war, civil asset forfeiture, mass warrantless surveillance. If that's not chaos the other way around, the person who says that is either completely ignorant of what total chaos is, which is what we live under today,
Mm,
and the rule of law is, which is supposed to be the Constitution as the supreme law of the land, or they're a lying manipulator. There's only two. That's the only way I can think of it.
wow. Tell us how you really feel.
I mean, ultimately, if the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, if the Constitution is never being followed, you couldn't be in a worse situation than we are today. And it is still going to get worse. We could say the same thing in 5 years, probably, and it will probably be significantly worse than it is now. Resisting violations of the Constitution, usurpations of power, arbitrary power, all the various ways that the founding generation, the old revolutionaries described it. That's how you keep it in check. And in fact, Lysander Spooner, in his great Defense for Fugitive Slaves, written in 1850, he didn't use the term nullification on this one. He did write about jury nullification specifically as well. But he said resistance is maintenance of the Constitution itself.
Mm.
That's the only way to keep it in check.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I was going to say something, and I lost my train of thought. Oh, well, yeah, I was going to say,
Oh, that's Spooner stuff. I could throw us all off.
it can. But it's funny because when people object to this stuff, the things that they say they fear the most are already happening. We already live under this
Yeah.
that they're already afraid of. It's amazing. But speaking of slavery,
I think in many ways,
oh, go ahead.
I was going to say in many ways, people are afraid of what it means. So they are living in fear. Fear, we know, is the foundation of government power. John Adams said it's the foundation of most governments. I just removed the word most. It is the foundation of government power. And understanding that keeping government in check requires resistance, noncompliance, and the like, various forms of nullification, jury, state, local, individual, all of it. That means people have to radically change how they look at their government and radically change how they live their lives. And I think in many ways, they're just afraid of what that means. So they'd rather defend the status quo. Well, if we get enough Supreme Court justices in there, maybe in the next 17 generations, one of them is going to do the right thing and all this stuff is going to go away. Well, that's never happened. So I think that's a big part of it as well. People literally being afraid to actually do what needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and in the vein of what Lysander Spooner was saying about slavery, here's the other objection.
Yes.
Yes. Jury nullification and state level nullification has been tied to slavery and segregation. It's been used to uphold that. So in the jury sense, jury would vote to acquit a white person or a member of the KKK who attacked or killed a black person, even though they knew he did it. That happened. also, several states used the concept to resist civil rights legislation or other types of laws that were aimed at preventing the government from discriminating or treating one race differently from another. So it does have a there is a dark part of nullification. Would you care to speak to that, sir?
Yeah, I'd love to. That is one of my favorite topics, actually. First of all, government has an incredibly dark history.
Yeah.
It has killed literally millions of people, millions upon millions of people. And I'm not just talking about the foreign wars. I'm talking about government regulations, health regulations, and the like. Old school Harry Brown interviews would talk about this quite a bit. But yes, nullification is a tool. And like any tool, people can use it for good or bad. And people who say that, well, some people use nullification for bad motives, is basically the gun grabber argument.
Yes, it is.
Someone should not own this gun because other people have used it for bad things. This is just an argument for total control. And it's also ignorant of the overall history of nullification, because nullification's most prominent success might be cannabis prohibition in modern times. But if not, it's nullification of the federal Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850, where all the northern states literally nullified the requirement to act as slave catchers for the federal government, used jury nullification in places like Wisconsin and Syracuse, New York, and in Boston to try to protect people from being kidnapped and taken back into bondage. And this was used so widely that when South Carolina seceded, they issued a document called the Declaration of the Causes for something explaining why they did their secession. It was like the same day or the following day. And after going through this whole explanation of how they viewed the Union under the Constitution, the number one complaint that they had, and they list every single state in the North, all of these states have nullified the Fugitive Slave Acts for 25 years or made them impossible to enforce. So their number one complaint was that nullification was so successful against federal slavery laws that they had to get out.
Yeah, and I'll even throw another one in there. So the scenario I laid out with the jury acquitting a KKK member for killing a black person, that also happened in reverse when runaway slaves,
yes,
would escape, and these slave catchers would be right on the trail. Sometimes they would escape them, and other times they would shoot them. They would shoot the slave catchers and kill them.
Yes,
and there were times where they were put on trial and they were acquitted because the jury nullified the conviction. So it has
absolutely, and it happened quite a bit. It happened quite a bit in Syracuse, New York, and in Ohio, and in Wisconsin, and in Boston, Massachusetts. I mean, literally in Boston, Massachusetts, the last guy who was taken back under the fugitive slave law was in 1854, Anthony Burns. This is a guy who had escaped slavery, was living in freedom. He was tricked into going to a place, and then they captured him. And what did they do? They literally showed up with axes and battering rams and broke him out of the prison. And then when they arrested people who actually did this once he escaped to slavery, they used jury nullification. Once he escaped from slavery, they used jury nullification to release those people. Then he was recaptured, sent to the South. Then they organized, bought him back into freedom. Then he escaped to Canada. But it's a very long, interesting process. And it also shows how nullification is really most successful when you use all kinds of different strategies. Sometimes it requires really ramping it up and busting people out. Not always. And especially when you don't have the vast majority of the people on your side, that's generally not a good approach. But ultimately, as Thomas Jefferson told us, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. It's the old Sun Tzu phrase, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. We're not going to get from where we are today, living under the empire, to the land of the free in a single step. There is no silver bullet, but all these little steps, some of them difficult, some of them not. All of us break. What is that book? Have you heard that book, like 3 Felonies a Day?
Yes.
I've not read this one yet, but there's a guy who wrote, so I'm familiar with it. I haven't read it, but the concept behind it is there's so many rules and regulations on the books that we're all committing 3 felonies a day. And I mean, maybe it should be 50.
There's there's the saying, we are a nation of laws. Have you ever read Overruled by Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch?
No, I have not.
You would love it. I'm going to send you the link to it. I read it. I'll probably read it multiple times, but he talks about exactly what you just said about how we have so many laws that we can't even count them anymore at the federal, state, or any.
Gorsuch said this?
Yeah, Gorsuch. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
and
wow. Okay.
yeah. If you read that book, you'll think you're reading a libertarian. Honestly, like you will, because
Huh.
the way he lays all this out. And after I got done reading that book, I changed that saying. We are a nation of too many laws because we have.
Yeah,
He
no
talks about.
doubt.
He talks about laws that are passed by legislatures, but he's also talking about the administrative state, all these bureaucracies. He tells all of these stories who have been railroaded because we just have so many freaking laws. A lot of us are really like nullifying them without even knowing it because we don't.
Happens all the time. Every time you speed, you're nullifying something. Every person who buys cannabis at their local dispensary or retail store here in Southern California or elsewhere, they're nullifying. Everyone who exercises their right of self-defense without getting a government permission slip. And I know you're out there. You're just not as open about it as the cannabis folks are. I know you're out there in the millions. You're all nullifying too. We just need more and more of the same on more issues.
Yes, yes. So here's another objection, and this one is about jury nullification. The objection is juries are supposed to follow the law and enforce the law, not make the law. So jury nullification allows jurors to ignore the law and substitute their personal morality or their personal values. Doesn't that undermine the democratic process and the separation of powers? Because if citizens want to change a law, shouldn't they just do it through electing legislators, not jury nullification?
Man, can I appeal to authority on this one?
Yes.
John Jay, the first Supreme Court Chief Justice. He literally say juries are supposed to judge not just the fact, but the law itself. Thomas Jefferson told us that the trial by jury is the only, not a good idea, but the only anchor ever invented by human beings that can hold a government to the principles of its constitution. So this is what it's for. They created this. I mean, the founders didn't create this. They inherited a tradition of trial by jury, but they saw the trial by jury via jury nullification, whether they called it that or not, as the only way to keep government in check once people have been arrested for something. So, I mean, if someone wants to tell me that juries aren't meant for that, that means they're just ignorant of the history behind it. I don't know how else to respond to that one, but
Yeah, and I think most people are ignorant, and they might be well-meaning, but they just don't know because most people don't know about this. But here's another one though: the supremacy clause makes federal law supreme over state and local law, right? So if the Constitution, if the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, doesn't that mean that states and localities have no legal authority to refuse to block the enforcement or to refuse enforcement of federal laws?
well, it's a pretty complex question because there's actually a few layers here. First of all, we can look at James Wilson described it best. He was also one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court. He was maybe more of the father of the Constitution in some ways than James Madison, a very important framer as well. And he explained it as our constitutions are superior to our legislatures, so the people are superior to their constitutions. So the food chain is government, constitution, people. And ultimately, if government says, oh, the supremacy clause means this, they're the bottom of the food chain. Because if the people say, oh, no, 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 supremacy clause only means your laws are supreme when done in pursuance of the Constitution, and we are going to nullify stuff beyond that, then too bad. So sad, pal. But can you repeat the full question? Because I had another piece in my head that I lost.
Yeah. So wait, let me go back. Hold on. Okay. Yeah. So Article 6 of the Constitution says federal law is the supreme law of
Yes.
the land. Doesn't that mean that states and localities have no legal authority to block or refuse enforcement of federal laws?
Well, there's two ways to look at this. Now, if the federal government, for example, is doing something in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution, like establishing a post office, let's come up with something kind of innocuous.
Mm.
Even though, for example, if we look back to Spooner, he thought that didn't mean that it meant that they couldn't do it exclusively. He could create his own private mail service. Even in that situation, the government didn't like it. But let's say they're doing something in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution. A state, according to James Madison himself, again, back to Federalist number 46, when he said use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union, he explained to us what that was for. That was for what he described as unwarrantable measures, his definition of unconstitutional acts, or warrantable but bad policy. So constitutional acts but bad policy. That's how you stop the bad policy, is the refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And when James Madison was president during the War of 1812 against Great Britain, they were calling forth the militia to go into national federal service. And a number of states in the Northeast, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Vermont, and Rhode Island said, we're not going to release these troops because you're telling us you're going to use them for unconstitutional purposes, without getting into the detail of this at all. But what they did in response was they published in local newspapers Madison's Federalist number 46 as a way to embarrass him. And it's really a great example of how even when people are good on explaining these things when they're out of power, once they get in power, they often kind of flip the switch and go the opposite direction. So ultimately, whether it's constitutional or not, if you're refusing to participate in the enforcement of this, you don't have to. And in fact, even the Supreme Court has agreed with this in a series of cases over 150 years. It's known as the anti-commandeering doctrine. It goes all the way back to a case in 1842 called Prigg versus Pennsylvania. This was regarding the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And there, Joseph Story said, he wasn't actually going to address the constitutionality of that act, although I think it would be unconstitutional. But he said, look, this is a federal act, and it's the federal government's job to enforce it. They cannot compel the states to participate in the enforcement of this. And then in modern times, we have various Supreme Court opinions. 1997, Prince versus U.S., this is where the Supreme Court also reinforced this view that comes right from James Madison in Federalist 46. This was about enforcing the Brady Act. The federal government, they said, well, they could have this Brady Act, but they couldn't require local governments, state governments to use personnel or resources to implement or effectuate federal acts or regulatory programs. This happens over and over and over. And this is why Trump has been getting, well, at least on his first term, we'll see what happens this time. He got smoked in federal court trying to shut down immigration sanctuary cities, because the immigration sanctuary cities are saying, well, we're hands off. We're not going to participate in enforcement. He sued over and over and over, especially California. And he repeatedly lost, because this is the basis of the anti-commandeering doctrine, 150 plus years of Supreme Court jurisprudence.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I mean, and I know people who are watching this who are very much against immigration or illegal immigration. They don't like sanctuary cities. But keep in mind, there are also Second Amendment sanctuary cities that a Democrat president like Biden would have loved to have taken on that way if he could. And these protections exist for that right as well as others. So realistically, it really boils down to what we are doing at the ground level. Like nullification, I mean, one thing that I've learned from you and that you've really highlighted is that this is a mindset. This is a mindset change that we have to go through. I mean, the mindset of the people during the founding era, they totally understood this. They had no problem with the idea of just saying, you know what, you passed this law, but I don't care. And we have some, like you said, we have some of that today, but it's almost like it's not as conscious. Like we're not as conscious of it as people were back then. Like they were saying, yes, this is an unjust law, and I'm deliberately going to disobey it. It's more just, well, I just want to light up a joint. And I'll take that too. I mean, I'll take that type of resistance and nullification too. But there has to be something that
I agree
in our, I hate to use the word collective, but our collective mindset at the
socialist.
I know.
Taxation is liberty, should your hat be saying after that.
It's for the greater good.
Man, so what you're really getting on something here, because the mentality of the founders, the old revolutionaries, really going back to the American Revolution, is that an act against the Constitution is void. James Otis Jr., in his great 4-hour speech against the writs of assistance in 1761, which we can really look to as the kickoff, the start of the American Revolution, the revolution being a radical change in the viewpoint of the people that led to the War for Independence. They're not the same. The War for Independence was not the American Revolution. It was the outcome of it. The revolution was this radical change that government is only allowed to do what government is supposed to be doing. And when it goes beyond that, its acts are void. And if government refuses to listen to the people when they say you've gone beyond your limits, then it's the duty of the people to stop them. How do they stop them? Well, you got to take small steps at first. For example, the Declaration results of the First Continental Congress, it had a list of grievances, like a precursor to the Declaration of Independence. It started out with the Declaratory Act, where the British Parliament claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, which is basically the same way that federal power views the so-called Supremacy Clause today. They have unlimited power based on what they decide. And what did they say in 1774? They said, to these grievous acts and measures, Americans cannot submit. And that is the mindset that they had. It took a few years to get to that, but that's really what you're getting at here. That, at least I think you have to have this mentality, not that I can only refuse to comply once I'm pushed to the point of desperation, but we cannot submit to these things, because even the smallest precedent is precedent for more and more power. John Dickinson in 1767 actually was talking about the Townshend Acts, a very small tax that a lot of people were basically saying, well, it's too small for us to stick our neck out on. And he said, actually, this is a fatal error, is how he put it. The smallness is what makes it most dangerous, because everything government does is to establish a precedent for future use. So if you don't even resist the tiniest things that should be easy, you shouldn't be surprised when government grows into a monster like we have today.
Well, it goes back to the point you made earlier about how reversing this whole thing is going to take step, by little step, inching towards liberty. That's what our government did. Our government didn't become this big overnight. It took years. It took decades. No, it took a long time.
Well, I mean, 1913 was a bad one.
Yeah. But even just though, but like,
it was a bad one, but it's accelerated. It's
has
accelerated, and year in and year out. The way John Adams described it, he said, encroachment upon the Constitution, so violations of the limits for government, is like a cancer. It's a deadly disease. He said it eats faster and faster every hour. So the worse it gets, the more it's going to get more authoritarian. It'll accelerate further and further and further, unless people actually connect the dots and see how we got from point A to where we are now, or where things are going to be. Then, well, it's going to be messy.
Yeah.
That's my cynical side. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so
I hate promising people. Politicians are promising people crap all the time. Elect me, or support this one amendment, or something like that. And I just cannot be that shady dude. I like to just lay it out there. I mean, there are so many laws, rules, and regulations on the books that no one can really count them. Yeah. That's not going to go away overnight. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, you're right. And it's good to lay it out in a more realistic way, because especially in America, we always want that instant gratification. If it is instant, if you and I are wrong and this does happen overnight, I will love it, but it won't. But it won't. So
that'd be amazing.
Yeah. So
sometimes having your expectations low means one of two things. Either you were right, not bad, or you're pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, exactly. You're absolutely right. So my last question is, what can, if people are, with the people who are watching this or who are listening to it later, what are some things that they can do to help push this forward, to help inch this closer towards where we want it to be?
I think it's, one of the hardest things is that we're getting basically hit from every direction. I mean, if this were a boxing match, we'd be getting obliterated, punched in the face, in the gut, over and over and over. How we, the people, are still standing, I don't know, but we're getting blasted with all kinds of surveillance, gun control, prohibition, asset forfeiture, regulations on businesses and human activity. They tell us the size of our toilet, what kind of light bulbs we can have. I mean, it's nuts how much they're doing constantly, and the facial recognition and the tracking of people and the Palantir stuff that they're trying to shove down our throats. It's bad. So I think one of the first things that people really can do if they want to be effective in advancing liberty, I mean, of course, we can talk about all the bad stuff all the time,
Right.
24/7, no problem. But if you want to be effective in actually turning things around, I think people should pick one thing that is so near and dear to their heart that they're willing to spend a ton of time on it, organizing people locally, maybe teaching people about this process, maybe working with your city council. Let's use the right to keep and bear arms, for example.
Mhm.
Why can't we get more and better local Second Amendment sanctuaries or right to keep and bear arms sanctuaries? Really convince your local community to say, we are not going to enforce any federal gun control measure on the books, past, present, or future. And then maybe do the same to the state. Keep them separate because legally they're the different things.
Yeah.
But work on one issue that's really important to you. Learn it top to bottom, and then get active close to the community that you live in. That's really, I think, where people can be most effective.
Amen. Awesome. Well, before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you, where they can find your work, all that good stuff.
What, my address? I'm going to dox myself?
Yeah. It's okay. Nobody in my audience wants to go to California anyway.
Probably not. Probably not. Even here in beautiful Orange County, everyone's welcome. So I'm over at 10th. Actually, the best thing I think people should do, if you want a URL, is 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. It's all spelled out, not the number 10. 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Every couple of years, we publish a State of the Nullification Movement report. And I think you can get a lot of really interesting ideas of how. The first half of it is basically the constitutional and revolutionary history behind nullification, and then some of the ways it was used throughout the early republic, for example, against the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850, but then also how people are actually using it in modern times, whether it's cannabis prohibition or to stop various surveillance programs or to opt out of the federal asset forfeiture program called equitable sharing, or to actually try to undermine the Federal Reserve by making gold and silver legal tender, which is happening in a bunch of states right now. So there are all kinds of things that people can do. And reading this free download, it's not one of these things where you got to give us your email. We're going to spam the crap out of you 24 hours a day. Just download the thing for free. It's also probably on Kindle. I don't really remember either, but it's a couple of years old, but a lot of the principles are still there. And then you'll see ideas of how maybe you can take action in your own community.
Awesome. I'll be checking that out myself. But again, thanks for
Cool.
joining us. I'm sure we got to get you back on soon, maybe to talk about some other issues, talk maybe about the 10th Amendment. That's important too. I would love to get you back on, but I appreciate you coming to join me.
I would love that. Thank you so much. We were way overdue on this, and I look forward to more in the future.
Awesome. And to my audience, until next time, stay free, stay principled, and most importantly, stay ungovernable.